Hello and welcome to another episode of Noetic Resonance. This week, this episode was brought to you by our fake sponsor with our game Overrated. It's brought to you by JCPenney's. 3 out of 5 stars. My asshole will never feel the same. How lovely. These random draws are amazing. I just truly love these. That was a little bit of humor too before our heavy episode this week. Before we begin, I want to take a moment with you. This episode covers territory that most of us were taught to move through quickly rather than sit inside. If you have been told that your grief is too much, too long, or too inconvenient for the people around you, this episode is for you. If you have been performing recovery before you were actually ready, this episode is for you as well. If your tears have ever been met with discomfort or impatience rather than presence, this episode is also for you. If you come from a tradition or a culture that has specific frameworks around grief and mourning, you are welcome here. I am not asking you to abandon what you carry. I am inviting you to look at it honestly and to consider whether it has given you permission to fully feel what is real. What I share here draws from biology, from scripture, from cross-traditional wisdom, and from my own experience of loss. I will tell you when something is established science versus interpretation. I will not pretend certainty where there is genuine complexity. Grief is one of the most human experiences that exist and one of the least honored in Western culture. This episode is an attempt to give it back its dignity. If you are currently in active grief, please be gentle with yourself as you listen. And if anything here brings up thoughts of harming yourself, please reach out for support. There is no shame in reaching out. Asking for help is one of the most courageous things a person can do. In the United States, if you can, call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline anytime, day or night. If you are outside the U.S., please search for your country's crisis line. You do not have to carry this alone. Now, let's talk about what your tears actually are and why they matter. Most of us were handed a story about grief before we ever had a chance to experience it honestly. The story goes something like this. Grief is a stage you pass through. There is a timeline for it. You are allowed to be sad for a certain period, and then you are expected to return to functioning. Crying too much means you are weak or stuck or making others uncomfortable. Crying in public is embarrassing. Men do not cry. Women who cry too much are manipulative or hysterical. And somewhere underneath all of it is the unspoken message that grief is a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be honored. That story has caused enormous harm. Not because it came from cruelty, but because it came from a culture that is fundamentally uncomfortable with what cannot be fixed quickly and efficiently moved past. What most of us were never told is that grief is not a malfunction. It is not a weakness. It is not a stage to get through as quickly as possible. Grief is one of the most sophisticated and necessary biological and spiritual processes available to an embodied human being. And the tears that accompany it are not simply the overflow of emotion. They are the body doing something specific, purposeful, and deeply intelligent. Before we talk about what grief means spiritually and how wisdom traditions across human history have understood it, we need to start with what is actually happening in your body when you cry, because the biology alone is enough to permanently reframe how you think about your tears. Not all tears are the same. That is not a metaphor, it is biology. The tears your eyes produce when you cut an onion or when wind hits your face are called reflex tears. They exist to protect and lubricate the eye. The tears that come when you are overwhelmed with grief or joy or relief are chemically distinct from those reflex tears in ways that matter enormously for understanding what your body is actually doing. Emotional tears contain cortisol, which is the body's primary stress hormone. They contain adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is a stress hormone released by the brain during times of pressure or overwhelm, and it is one of the markers researchers use to distinguish emotional tears from other types. They contain prolactin, which is associated with emotional processing, and they contain leucine enkephalin, which is a natural painkiller produced by the body itself. When you cry emotionally, you are literally excreting stress chemistry through your tears. The body is not malfunctioning, it is detoxing in real time. It is using one of its most sophisticated regulatory mechanisms to move what it cannot hold. There is more. Crying activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the branch of your autonomic nervous system responsible for rest, digestion, and recovery. This is the counterpart to the fight or flight response. When you cry and feel that deep exhaustion afterward, that is not collapse. That is your nervous system completing a stress response cycle and shifting into recovery mode. The tiredness you feel after genuine crying is your body saying the work is done for now. Rest. This means that tears are somatic release, the body doing exactly what it was designed to do. And suppressing them is suppressing a biological regulatory process with real downstream consequences for your nervous system, your immune system, and your overall capacity to function. You are not designed to hold everything in. The design includes a release valve, and it is one of the most elegant pieces of biological engineering in the human system. The body keeps score. That phrase has become familiar in trauma-informed circles, and it is worth understanding specifically in the context of grief and suppressed tears. When we consistently override the impulse to cry, whether because we are taught that crying is weakness, because it is not safe to show vulnerability, because we need to stay strong for others, or simply because the culture around us communicated that grief should be private and brief, the stress chemistry that was meant to move through us stays inside us. Over time, suppressed grief stores itself in the body. People who have done significant somatic work, body work, or trauma-informed therapy often report unexpected tears arising during sessions when they are not consciously thinking about anything sad. That is not random. That is the body finally finding a safe enough container to release what it has been holding, sometimes for years or even decades. Suppressed grief shows up as chronic tension in the throat, the chest, and the shoulders. It shows up as a kind of emotional flatness or numbness that people sometimes mistake for healing, but is actually freeze. It shows up as fatigue that rest does not solve, as a low-grade sadness with no identifiable cause, as difficulty feeling genuine joy even when circumstances are good. The nervous system that has learned it is not safe to cry stays in a low-level state of activation even during calm periods. It never fully gets to complete the cycle because it learned long ago to stop the cycle before it finishes. This is why permission matters so much. Not permission from someone else, permission from yourself. The body is waiting for a signal that it is finally safe enough to let go of what it has been carrying. That signal has to come from you. The understanding that grief is sacred and tears are holy is not a modern therapeutic insight. It runs through virtually every wisdom tradition that has engaged honestly with the human experience of loss. The Hebrew scriptures treat grief not as a problem to be resolved, but as a legitimate and even necessary response to suffering. The entire book of Lamentations is exactly what its name suggests, a prolonged communal weeping over destruction and loss. It is not presented as a failure of faith. It is presented as an honest and appropriate response to genuine devastation. The book exists in the canon because the tradition understood that some experiences require sustained mourning rather than quick recovery. The Psalms are saturated with grief language that is often raw and unfiltered. Psalms 22 opens with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words of abandonment and anguish directed straight at the divine without apology. Psalms 88 ends in darkness with no resolution. These texts were preserved precisely because they tell the truth about what grief actually feels like from the inside. They give language to experiences that otherwise feel unspeakable. The book of Job is one of the most sophisticated treatments of grief in any tradition. Job loses everything and then spends most of the book arguing, weeping, and refusing the tidy explanations his friends offer. His friends represent the voices that tell grieving people to find the lesson, trust the plan, and move on. God vindicates Job over his friends at the end of the book. That is worth sitting with. The one who raged and wept and refused false comfort is the one the text honors. Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, even knowing he was about to raise him. He did not bypass the grief because he had the solution. He entered it fully first. In Gethsemane, as always, thank you for your patience with my pronunciations, his distress was described in physical and somatic terms: sweating, anguish, the full embodied experience of dread. And in Revelation 21, God is described as personally wiping every tear from every eye, an image that assumes tears are real, known, and worthy of divine attention. Moving beyond the Hebrew and Christian traditions, the Bhagavad Gita opens with Arjuna collapsing in grief on the battlefield, his bow falling from his hands, unable to function. The entire teaching that follows emerges from that moment of breakdown. Krishna does not tell him to stop feeling. He meets him inside the grief and teaches from there. The wisdom comes through the breakdown, not around it. In Buddhist tradition, the story of Kisa Gotami is one of the most tender accounts of grief in any sacred literature. She lost her young child and carried the body through the village searching for medicine to revive him. The Buddha did not dismiss her grief or tell her to accept impermanence. He sent her on a journey that allowed her to discover through lived experience that loss is universal. Her grief was honored as the doorway to her awakening, not an obstacle to it. Rumi's poetry is essentially one long meditation on grief as a spiritual pathway. The opening image of the Masnavi is the reed flute, crying because it has been cut from the reed bed it came from. That cry of separation, that longing, that ache is not presented as a problem to solve. It is presented as the very sound of the soul reaching towards its origin. Tears in Sufi tradition are evidence of love and spiritual sensitivity. They are not weakness. They are proof that something real is alive inside you. Across indigenous traditions, Celtic keening, Jewish mourning practices, the sitting of Shiva, the wailing wall, professional mourners in Egyptian tradition, grief has been given a body, a practice, a duration, and a communal container. These traditions understood something the modern Western world has largely lost. Grief needs to be witnessed. It needs space and time and community. It cannot be adequately processed alone and in private on a timeline set by productivity culture. The consistent thread across all of these traditions is not that grief is comfortable or that it resolves neatly. It is that grief is real, that it deserves to be honored, and that the tears accompanying it are not a malfunction. They are a sacred release. It is worth pausing to name something directly. The way Western culture handles grief is not the universal human default. It is a specific cultural choice, and when you compare it honestly to how other traditions have approached loss, the contrast is striking. In Mexico and many Latin American communities, the Dia de los Muertos tradition treats grief as an ongoing relationship rather than a one-time event to move past. The dead are welcomed back annually. Altars are built with their photographs and favorite foods. Families gather at grave sites to eat and celebrate and remember together. Grief is not privatized or compressed. It is communal, reoccurring, and woven into the fabric of ordinary life. In many West African and African diaspora traditions, mourning incorporates music, dance, and communal expression. The body moves grief through collective sound and rhythm. Grief is not something you process alone in a quiet room. It is something the community holds together and moves through together. Korean culture carries a concept called han, which describes a collective sorrow, a kind of grief that is cultural and generational rather than purely individual. It acknowledges that some grief is not just personal, but it is carried in the bones of a people across time. That framework validates grief that has no single identifiable source, the diffuse ache of loss that many sensitive people carry without knowing quite where it comes from. Indigenous traditions across many continents build specific mourning periods, mourning songs, mourning dress, and mourning ceremonies into the structure of community life. Grief has a container that the whole community participates in creating and holding. The bereaved person is not left alone to manage their loss on a timeline set by employers or social expectations. What these traditions share is an understanding that grief is communal, that it needs time, that it benefits from ritual and witness, and that the person grieving is not a problem to be efficiently returned to productivity. They are a human being moving through one of the most significant experiences life offers, and they deserve to be accompanied in that. The Western model, by contrast, tends to privatize grief, compress its timeline, and treat extended mourning as dysfunction. Bereavement leave is measured in days. The expectation to return to normal is swift. The person who is still visibly grieving months later is often met with concern or impatience rather than continued presence. That is not ancient wisdom. That is industrialization applied to human emotion. Knowing this matters because it means the shame many people carry about how long their grief lasts or how much space it takes up is not coming from some universal human standard. It is coming from a specific cultural framework that prioritizes function over feeling and efficiency over genuine healing. Your grief is not too much. The container you were given was too small. There is a difference between grief that moves through you and grief that moves into you permanently. The first is somatic release doing its work. The second is the nervous system caught in a loop it does not know how to exit. Both feel like grief from the inside, which is part of what makes it difficult to know where you are. Grief that is moving through tends to come in waves, intense periods followed by spaces of relative calm. Over time, not on any fixed schedule, the waves gradually space out. They do not disappear, they become more manageable. The person begins to rebuild a life that includes the loss rather than being defined entirely by it. Grief that has become identity works differently. The acute phase does not transition. The waves do not space out. The loss becomes the primary lens through which all life is filtered. New connection and possibility feel like betrayal of the person or thing that was lost. Letting the grief soften feels like letting go of the last bond with what is gone. This is where clinically what is called prolonged grief disorder lives. It is worth naming clearly that it is not a moral failure or a sign of loving too much. It is what happens when the nervous system gets stuck in a cycle it does not know how to complete. Often because the loss was traumatic, there was insufficient support during the acute phase, or because the grief became wrapped up in the person's sense of who they are. Spiritually, some indigenous frameworks understand that excessive prolonged mourning can actually tether the spirit of the departed, keeping them from moving forward because the grief of the living holds them. Mourning practices in many traditions have specific durations not to rush the griever, but to honor both the living and the dead. In Buddhist teaching, attachment to grief can become its own form of suffering we choose to maintain because releasing it feels like a second loss. Letting grief complete can feel like letting go of the last connection, and so we hold it past its natural season. The shadow side of grief becoming identity is that it gives the self a container when the self does not know who it is without the loss. This is where pastoral and clinical support becomes genuinely necessary. The person needs help building an identity that includes the loss rather than being entirely organized around it. These are some practical markers worth sitting with honestly. When grief begins to replace rather than honor what was lost, when it becomes the primary way you introduce yourself yourself to the world, when it forecloses on new connection or possibility rather than deepening your capacity for both, when tears stop bringing relief and instead leave you more activated or more depleted rather than released. Tears as somatic release complete a cycle. Grief that has become identity keeps recycling without completion. The body knows the difference, even when the mind does not. Sometimes grief comes at inconvenient moments. In the car, at work, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Here are some simple and practical ways to meet it rather than to push it away. First, breathe into it rather than away from it. When you feel grief rising, the instinct is to often tighten, to hold the breath, to brace against it. Try the opposite. Take a slow breath in and let the exhale be longer than the inhale. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system and signals to your body that it is safe to feel. Second, put your hand on your chest or your belly. Physical self-contact is grounding. It communicates safety to the nervous system and keeps you present in your body rather than disassociating away from the feeling. Third, if you can, find privacy and let it move. Cry if the tears come. Make sound if sound wants to come. Let your body move if it wants to shake or rock. These are not dramatic responses. They are the completion cycles your body is trying to run. Fourth, after the wave passes, drink water. Take a few slow breaths and give yourself a moment before returning to whatever you were doing. The body just did significant work, and a brief transition honors that. If grief arrives and you genuinely cannot be present with it in that moment, that is okay too. You can say to yourself, I see you, I will come back to you, and then intentionally return to it later when you have space. The key is not to permanently file it away, but to make a genuine agreement with yourself to return. When you need to file grief away temporarily and return to it intentionally, a few things help make that a real agreement rather than a permanent avoidance. Name it specifically to yourself. Not just, I am feeling something, but I am feeling grief about this specific loss and I am going to come back to it tonight or this weekend. The more specific the agreement, the more likely your nervous system will trust it. Create a physical anchor for the return. Some people journal briefly, even just a sentence or two, to acknowledge what came up before setting it aside. Others light a candle or sit quietly for 2 minutes as a way of saying, I see this and I will come back. The ritual does not need to be elaborate. It just needs to be intentional. Honor the agreement when the time comes. Find a private space. Put on music if that helps you access emotion. Look at a photo or hold an object connecting you to what you are grieving, and give yourself genuine, unstructured time to feel without agenda. Not to process efficiently or arrive at acceptance, but to simply be present with what is there. If you find yourself repeatedly filing grief away and never returning to it, that is worth noticing as well. It may mean the grief needs more support than you can give it alone, and that reaching out to a counselor or a grief group is the next right step. Grief does not need to be performed or rushed or hidden. It just needs to be met. If you have been told that your grief is too much, too long, too loud, or inconvenient for the people around you, I want to speak directly to you now. Your tears are not weakness. They are your body doing sacred work. They are cortisol leaving. They are stress chemistry completing its cycle. They are the parasympathetic nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. They are the soul processing what the mind cannot hold alone. You are allowed to grieve fully. You are allowed to take the time it actually takes. You are allowed to cry without apologizing for it, explaining it, or making it more comfortable for the people watching. And if you have not been able to cry, if the tears will not come even when you know they should, that is also information worth paying attention to. The body sometimes needs safety, support, or skilled help before it will release what it has been holding. That is not failure. That is the nervous system protecting you until it believes it is safe enough to let go. I want to share something personal here. I have sat with grief in many forms throughout my life. My own losses, the losses of people I love, the collective grief of watching suffering I could not fix. And what I have learned is that the grief I tried to manage and contain quietly caused far more harm in my body and my life than the grief I allowed to move through me fully. The moments when I let myself actually feel it, when I stopped performing composure and let the tears come, when I allowed my body to shake or keen or go completely still. Those were not my weakest moments. They were some of my most honest ones. And on the other side of them, I was more present, more clear, more genuinely available to the people and the work I love. Grief is not the enemy of a full life. Suppressed grief is. The wisdom traditions we talked through today understood something that modern Western culture has largely forgotten. Grief needs a body. It needs time. It needs witnesses. It needs to be honored rather than managed. When we give it those things, it does what it was designed to do. It moves through, it transforms, it becomes part of the fabric of who we are rather than the weight we carry apart from everything else. Your tears are sacred. The loss you carry is real. The time it takes is the time it takes. Give yourself permission to feel what is real. The release on the other side is worth it. As always, I love you, I see you, and none of us are left behind. Next week, we are going to be talking about being sovereign in your skin and the frequencies of sacred embodiment. Until next time, may your path be aligned, your gnosis be clear, and the veil be ever thin. Our journey continues. Thank you for all the love and support, you beautiful souls.